Hey, so we're so glad that you're checking out this video, and our prayer is that it helps those who are far from God become committed followers of Jesus Christ. However, what we don't want is for this video to be a replacement for church. It can't be a replacement for church. We believe that the gathering of believers in covenant community with other believers at the local church matters. And what's more is that God designed us to be in community with one another. That said, if you're in the North Georgia area and you don't have a church you call home, we'd love to have you come and visit Brainerd, North Georgia. I'm praying that this message serves as a blessing to you, that it helps you, encourages you, and even challenges you, all the while bringing you closer to Jesus. So again, super excited that you're checking out this video. Just don't treat this video as a replacement for church, and I think that the Lord will honor that and see your commitment to the local church.
We're in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 through 17, as Abby so kindly read for all of us this morning. And what we'll be doing this morning is a continuation of what we started last week. We've been walking through the book of 1 Peter, so if you're visiting for the very first time, that's what we do here at Brainerd. We're expositionalists by trade, and so what that means is we're going to start in a book and we're going to walk through it all the way. And our desire is to be able to point you to the point of the passage, which then in turn is the point of today's sermon, and then we want to apply that to the life of the congregation. That's how we work through sermons, all right? So we're in 1 Peter chapter 3, and as I mentioned, this is coming off the heels of last week, so this is part 2 of what Peter's train of thought was from last week, and we had an opportunity to be able to see how we as believers should respond in the midst of suffering or in the midst of persecution or in the midst of what may be oppression to what the Bible does say about particular subject matters or about Jesus himself or about how we conduct our everyday life. And so what you and I should do in the midst of those kind of moments where perhaps we may be culturally out of place because of our beliefs is we should respond in a particular manner in order for us to be able to be very winsome with the gospel. And so I believe that Peter is carrying over an idea, a main idea for all of us to be able to think about, which will be the idea that will be the rest of our conversation this morning, or what the sermon will be all about. All right, so let me guide your attention up here to the boards behind me, to the boards in front of you. Here's what I believe the main idea that Peter's conveying from verses 14 through 17 is. Believers should respond as Christ, both inside and outside of the church, as a visible demonstration of the gospel. In other words, guys, we, based on our response, both in here and outside of these walls, to those who do not believe what we believe, should compel others so much so that as they see the gospel written all over you, both through your words and through your actions, should be able to be compelled to say, I want to know more about the God that you live for, the God that you serve, the God that you've given your life to. I want to see all of you to be a visible demonstration of the gospel, that you shine as the gospel, or as Jesus himself said, to be salt and light in this world. All right, so here's how we're going to break apart the text today so that we can see how this main idea fits into this text. All right, here are the four ways, that I believe God calls us to respond inside and outside of the church. First of all, we should respond with courage, and we're going to see how Peter describes that. Secondly, we are called to cling to Christ. Thirdly, we are called to testify about Christ. And then lastly, we are called to respond with respect and consideration of who? Of those both inside and outside of the church. All right, so let's begin with this very first point, which is what God calls us to do, and that is to respond with courage. Now, it's worth reading one more time, so let me get your attention to go back to verse 14, and in particular, the latter portion of verse 14. It says this, do not fear them or be intimidated. Peter here is very careful with his words, and he's very intentional with what he is saying here to the believers at that very moment. And it's important that I say that, at that very moment. Let me take us to the context real quick so you can see why Peter's writing what he's writing at this very moment to this group of Christians. If you remember, they're living in a Roman society, which means that there is a ruler over this Roman nation, and that ruler is none other than Caesar himself, right? And in particular, it's Nero. And if you know anything about Nero, you remember Nero, he is a vicious individual who hated Christians and had a disposition to say, I want to wipe out Christians. In fact, Peter would know that very well because he felt the ramifications of that disposition by Nero himself as he was crucified upside down because of what he believed in, and that is Jesus. And so that's the context, right? And so the context as well, also knowing that they're in a Roman society, you had believers who came to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ and were now declaring that Jesus is Lord. In other words, that he is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and they're saying that in the midst of a society whereby Caesar was known to be Lord, and there was no other Lord other than Caesar. And so you can imagine the weight of them saying that Jesus is Lord. He is the ultimate king. He is the ultimate authority, especially when you had Caesars that fancied themselves to be gods, right? That is in complete opposition to what the cultural norm was and what they believed in. They were pitting themselves against Caesar, saying, no, there's only one king, one Lord. It doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge you as a ruler, but my ultimate authority is Jesus himself, right? What's more is that they are in a pluralistic society. What does that mean? That's a $50 word, Paul. A pluralistic society means that there were a lot of religions during that day, a lot of gods that people worshiped. And now you had Christians saying not only is Jesus Lord, but he is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by him. In other words, they're exclaiming the exclusivity of Jesus, that there isn't any other gods. There's only one true God, and that is Jesus. And yeah, sure, there's a lot of these idols in this Roman culture, but they are nothing but idols. They're nothing more than that. We serve the real, true, and living God. And so that's the context that they're saying this. And these Christians are hearing from Peter, I don't want you to be disturbed. I don't want you to be terrified. I don't want you to be distressed or intimidated. That's what that word fear means. Disturbed, terrified, or even distressed. That's what he's conveying to these Christians. Now, you can imagine, these Christians are hearing these words from Peter, knowing that in the backdrop, not only are they standing for the very truth that I just finished talking about, but they know that standing for those truths came at a great cost. In other words, they knew of Christians who were persecuted for their faith. They knew of Christians that even were martyred for their faith. They understood that following Jesus came at a cost, so much so that it would even cost them their life for saying what they were saying, that Jesus is Lord. And so here it's in that context that Peter says, I don't want you to be fearful and I don't want you to be intimidated for standing for what you believe in. Now, that must have come as a rather weighty statement from Peter, knowing that, man, I know what I'm looking at, I know what I'm facing at, but this is what I am called to do, is not to bend in fear, not to be intimidated, but rather to be courageous in this very moment. So today, we may not face the very same kinds of fear or intimidation that they were facing. I mean, real, true persecution that was physical harm to these believers or even death towards a believer. But nonetheless, Peter's conveying here the same kind of feelings that we would face today as they would face. those fears or there's intimidations for the very things that we would stand for or believe in even today. And so think about it, right? We are saying the same thing. Jesus is Lord. There's one way to heaven, right? And what's more is that we have a moral ethic that we live by today that's very different than the ideology or the cultural norms of today. And so when we stand for those kinds of things, we begin to feel rather out of place within culture or within society because of what we believe and what we stand for and how we live. We'll give you a couple examples of it. Well, I've mentioned a few of these before, but saying that Jesus is Lord in today's context means that it obliterates any form of autonomy within our society. In other words, it obliterates the idea that no one is accountable to God. Rather, what Peter's conveying here when you say that Jesus is Lord is that all of us, because we are created by God, we are accountable to our Creator. And so therefore, this idea that you can live for yourself, you can do what you want, and you do you and all this stuff, that is completely antithetical to what the gospel teaches, where we are to lay down our lives and give our lives to the Lord, right? That's what the gospel is. Furthermore, think about it. Some of the hot topic issues that we talk about today are some of the things that make us feel so out of place or even culturally different, right? But yet, it's what we believe. We believe in a holy sexuality, right? Where we believe that God created sex as a good gift for all of us, but yet it's to be used and it's to be enjoyed within the confines of marriage, right? And what's more is that God created both male and female, and that is how the family is constructed, and that is by design by God. That's what He instituted. That's what He created. What's more is that God created specific genders, right? Male and female. And so think about it. You saying all of that, you standing for all of that, yeah, that comes with a lot of ramifications today because you're saying these things in a culture that says, no, you can be what you want. You can reassign your own gender. It's fluid these days. You can have whatever kind of sexual ethic you desire to have. All of that can be fine and well. You can do all those things. Meanwhile, we're saying, no, that's not what it should be like. Think about it. Imagine saying in today's day that you are not Lord over your gender, God is. And that is a massive statement in the midst of our individualistic kind of society. And it's in that same context that Peter says, don't fear them or be intimidated. Now, mind you, I get it. You may not be living in a Christian bubble. You may not even be working in a Christian bubble. And so this comes at a great cost for you as you stand for these convictions and as you speak under these convictions, right? Or for these convictions. But then remember, Peter's not only telling us, but he's telling those Christians in those days, knowing that they would be facing persecution and martyrdom for their faith, right? And so he tells them, I know that Nero is reigning. I know that you're living in a pluralistic society. Don't fear. Rather than embracing that fear, embrace a courage to stand for those convictions. Now, it begs the answer to the question, how did they deal with that fear? What does the Bible say about how we should approach these moments where we are intimidated or we are fearful for the things that we stand for? We'll get to that here in just a few moments. But first, I wanted to make something clear before I get to that. The reason that you and I are willing to face criticism or persecution is not because we think of ourselves as some elitist, religious, self-righteous kind of group. No, that's not what we are. We're all admittedly broken people that need Jesus, right? That's all of us, right, in this room. We stand for what we stand for, and we're willing to face criticism or a raised eyebrow in our day, or even being willing to feel ostracized within our cultural context, right? Because we believe that God designed us not to be autonomous or individuals amongst ourselves, but rather God created us to have a relationship with Him, right? God designed us to worship Him. We are meant to be in this relationship with God. That's by design. What's more is that we say the things that we say about marriage because we believe that God instituted marriage. He designed marriage, and that is His way of seeing couples flourish within marriage. It's a good thing. He designed it, right? Even within our holy sexual ethic, right? God designed that in a way for it to flourish and to be good and to be enjoyed, and for God to see people be honored in the way that He designed it to be in that manner, right? What's more is we say the things that we say about gender, not because we think that we're some sort of self-righteous kind of group or we're trying to bash people over the head. We say the things that we say because we believe that Christianity speaks to that in such a profound way that a person's gender is not an accident but a design. In other words, a person is not a mistake. God designed you exactly as you're intended to be designed, and God loves you enough to give you dignity, value, and respect in that way. And so we say the things that we say, and we're willing to face the criticism of it because we believe that what we're saying is good and right and truthful. It's intended to be said in a way that we say, this matters to you. It's important. Now, mind you, what's more, guys, is people are in a flood of ideas that are false. And guys, we have the truth to be able to speak. We have righteousness written all over this book we call the Bible, right? We believe that the Bible is not a book of fables, but truth. And so that's why we say the things that we say. And hear me, guys, if no one else but us, then who to speak about the truth and to say that these things matter? And again, that's under the backdrop of knowing that there is a flood of ideas and falsehoods that are being stated to people all across this world and even outside of these walls in our society. And if we don't say something, if we don't say, no, this truth matters, that Jesus matters, that you are valued, you are important to Him, that these things are done by Him on purpose, then no one else will, right? The church has the truth. And so think about this. I love what J. Gresham Machen says. J. Gresham Machen, I'm sorry, I said that way too fast. Here's what he says about taking into consideration how important it is for us to speak truth in a winsome manner within our society. He says the following words: false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there. If we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by false ideas and ideologies that aren't even true, right? And we don't ever say anything at all, then Christianity can just be regarded as nothing more than just a harmless delusion. Just people gathering together on Sunday for some weird therapeutic stuff. But that's not what it is. We have something more to offer than just some supposed delusion. We have the truth. And we have an opportunity to be able to speak that truth. And so Peter gets it. I know that there's fear. I know that there's intimidation for the things that you speak of, the things that you stand for. But he says, I want you to respond with courage, right? Now, not all intimidation is bad. I like the kind of intimidation that keeps all the boys away from my girls. That's the kind of intimidation that I do like. Right? That's cool. I'm cool with that, right? But even in the midst of intimidation, he says, I want you to respond with courage. Now, is this a courage that you just kind of muster up on your own strength? No. No. How do you do that? He answers the question. You do that by clinging to Christ. Look at this second point, especially in verse 15. Notice what he says here. He says, coming off the heels, do not fear them or be intimidated, but in your hearts regard Christ as Lord and holy. And Lord as holy. Now, he uses that statement in this context, and I believe that the key word in this phrase that shows us how we ought to respond is that word regard, okay? And your translation may say honor, or it may say set apart. Now, what does honoring, regarding, or even as I said in this point, clinging onto Christ have to do with everything that I just finished saying in verse 14? Now think about it. Peter here knows exactly what the church needed as they were facing this fear and this intimidation. They needed a heavenly, glorious view of who Jesus is. They needed to be reminded that Jesus is both Lord and holy. You may say, is that it? Is that enough? 100% it is enough, and that is good to be reminded of. Now, notice how this works its way out. This is so cool. I wish we had more time to dive into where Peter is borrowing from here, but I believe he's borrowing from the book of Isaiah, and he constructs this sentence in such a profound way. Now watch this. This is so cool, okay? He leaves here no room for ambiguity about who Jesus is. He says that the same Yahweh, Lord, that you find in Isaiah's writings is the same Yahweh that he's talking about right here in the book of 1 Peter. In other words, he's saying Jesus is Yahweh. He is God. He is Lord. He is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, right? This is the Alpha. This is the Omega. This is God that he is talking about. And that couldn't have come at a greater encouragement for these believers, all right? What's more is that knowing that he is Lord means that he is sovereign, which means he is authoritative over all things, under all circumstances, over every location, every place. He is sovereign over that situation right there, which meant that he is sovereign over even the persecutions and the sufferings that they were facing, which meant that their suffering and their persecution wasn't purposeless, but purposeful. And he's speaking into that, which means God is not caught off guard by what is happening. Just as he was sovereign over Job's life, he is sovereign over their lives. And he knows that even in the midst of suffering and persecution, he's going to use that ultimately for their good and his glory. What's more is that if Jesus is Lord over all those things, Peter's been building up this idea that he is also Lord over death. Now think about this. This is important because the kind of fears and intimidations that they were facing meant that they would see as a great possibility death through persecution. And he's saying, listen to me, Jesus is not only Lord over this world, he's Lord over death. These believers in that day knew full well what it meant to have a commitment towards Jesus, and what they needed to be reminded of is that Jesus is in fact the resurrected one who can overcome death. In fact, Peter already told them, if you remember, that they didn't have a dead hope, but a living hope, right? Jesus, again, is Lord over death, which means that you and I remained untouched just as them until God says so, by death. We remain untouched. You and I are not at the mercy of circumstances. You and I are not at the mercy of nature. God is sovereign over all of these things. I love what John Piper says. He says, you are immortal until God's work for you is done. Think about that. They're called to declare the gospel in an environment where persecution and death is real. And that couldn't have come as a greater encouragement than to say that Jesus is Lord, right? When you have that kind of a theology set in your hearts, because he says, that's where I want you to deposit these truths, right? Like seeds in a ground that you put into and you cover up and you water, and then those roots dig deep into the ground, right? So that they can grow tall and flourish, right? He says, I want you to deposit the truth of knowing that Jesus is Lord within your heart, where your emotions are, where your decisions are, where your will is, all of that, where all of that resides. He says, I want you to deposit that in your hearts, right? And when you have that set, that kind of theology in your hearts, then you can say, as the Apostle Paul said, To live is Christ, and to die is what? Gain. When you know that, man, that changes the way that you live. Furthermore, Jesus is also the one in Revelation, like I mentioned, He's the Alpha, He's the Omega. He's the holy Lamb of God, the one seated at the right hand of the Father. He is God, and He is judge, and He is just. He's holy, which means that there will one day come a reckoning for all of the evil that is in this world and all of the injustice that is in this world. And that couldn't have come as a greater comfort for these believers to know that as they faced persecution, as they faced injustice, God is Lord and He is holy. So think about this for just a second, guys. What else do you have to hold on to when you face intimidation or fear? The world may have a lot of answers for how you are to face fear and intimidation, but here, the Bible is giving us a clear answer for how we face fear and intimidation. This is what makes, I believe, Christianity so compelling and so attractive to people and for all of us to hold on to. It's because Jesus answers the greatest question that all of us avoid or want to avoid but need an answer for. What happens after death? What happens when death comes knocking? Right? And we have to face it. Jesus is the resurrected one, the living hope, the one who conquered death, hell, and the grave. And when you know that, then you can answer every other question prior to that. What do we do when we have to face things? What do we do, Paul? When in my workplace, I'm making a stand. What do I do when in my everyday life I encounter a conversation and I have to say something about the things that I believe in or what I live for? When you know that's coming up and you know that life's greatest question is answered, well, then all those other questions can get answered and you can face them, not because you mustered up enough strength, but because you know where your hope lies. Right? That's how you can answer. And listen to me. If Jesus is worth clinging on to, isn't it true that He is worth declaring? Because if He's that worthy to say, I'm going to hold on to Jesus because that's what's going to give me courage, that's what's going to give me an opportunity to face these things, then surely He is worthy to be spoken of, which leads to this third point, right? We need to respond in such a way that we're called to testify, to speak, to declare about Christ. So notice what it says in verse 15. You may have heard this verse before, probably in isolation, but not in its context. But that's where you hear this verse in context. Listen to it. But in your hearts, regard Christ as Lord. Listen, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. That's that verse in context. In other words, within persecution, within suffering, within hurt, Peter says, be ready to give a defense for the hope that you have, for the reason that you believe what you believe in, right? Perhaps you may have heard it always in isolation, but contextually, Peter's saying, yes, I want you to know how to defend your faith. It's not any less than that, but I want you to also be ready to do so when the world sees you hurting and suffering. So on the one hand, he says, hey, how will you answer when somebody questions you for why you believe what you believe? When they say, why do you live like you do? Why are you willing to face criticism like you do? Why is it that you live and conduct your marriage the way that you do? Why are you willing to say, man, covenant marriage matters to our family? Why are you willing to stand to say, no, the way we invest in our family, the way we disciple our children, the way we spread the gospel, it matters. Why do you do that? Why do you live with integrity within the workplace? Why are you willing to not disparage other people or speak hatefully towards others? Why is it that even when coworkers are making fun of you, You treat them with dignity and respect and love. Why do you do that? And then furthermore, take it a step further. How is it that you respond the way that you do when all of a sudden the person on the other line of the phone is the doctor calling you with a prognosis that isn't the best? Right? When you're really facing life's challenges and your body is failing and you're hurting and you realize, right, that life is short. And you're feeling it, right? Like when you're young, you're like, I don't care, right? And when you're older, you're thinking more of how you were when you were younger. And then when you're in middle age, it's like, I don't know what to do. Right? You get like you're all over the place, right? Because you don't know where to land. How do you respond with the gospel at all points of your life in this way? That's what Peter is talking about here, even within its context. But furthermore, I believe that here Peter's bringing up two specific things. One, a responsibility, a personal responsibility to grow. And furthermore, a personal responsibility to speak well towards others. And we'll get to that here in just a few moments. But listen to me. First and foremost, we have a personal responsibility to grow. Listen to what it says. It says in verse 15, I want you to be ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you. That word there, ready, is literally what it means. Ready, right? In other words, you and I should have a disposition that we should know at the very minimum the essentials, the fundamentals of our faith. We should know the gospel. We should be able to articulate the actual gospel. And furthermore, even what Peter's been building up is that we even have a responsibility to be able to say that we know how to articulate the most important part of that gospel, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? Because without that, our faith is meaningless. And so he's saying, I want you to be able to give a reason for everything that you design your life by because of the gospel. And what's more is that it's spontaneous when it takes place. That's why he says there's nothing necessarily formal here. He says at any time when anyone asks you. So he's saying, hey, at any portion of your life, whenever you're going about your daily life or when you're in your workplace, you give reason for what you believe in. And listen to me, guys. If you and I say that Jesus is worthy to cling on to, then surely he is worthy to be known, and he is worthy to be spoken of in a way that we can share a complete gospel with other people. And so let me ask you a question, believer. Do you know how to articulate the gospel? Do you know how to be able to share that in such a way where people can hear it and say, I got it. I understand where you're coming from. That's the challenge that he gives us. Not only does he give us a challenge to be ready to testify about Christ, but then we also have another personal responsibility to be able to respond with respect and even consideration of others. So he says, what we need to do, we need to be ready to give a defense, right, of the hope that we have. But then he says, I want you to see how you ought to do that. Listen to what verse 16 and 17 say. Within the context, it says, yet do this with gentleness and reverence, keeping a clear conscience. In other words, what he's saying there is, I want your conduct, even in an instance where you are being slandered perhaps, or even insulted for your faith, I want you to walk away knowing that with a clear conscience, you were able to rightly speak and even treat people with dignity and with respect as you answered back. How do I know that? Listen to what it says. It says, yet do this with gentleness and reverence, keeping a clear conscience, so that when you are accused, those who disparage your good conduct in Christ will be put to shame. Verse 17, for it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Now, I love those two words that Peter brings up here. Gentleness and reverence. Right? Let me begin with the first one, which is reverence. Okay, now, is Peter talking about here that we need to have like this weird, intimidating fear of other people? No, that's not what he's saying here. What he's saying here is to respect other people. In what way? To remember that every person, even though they may not believe like you, are made in the image of God, which means that we need to value them, we need to respect them, we need to give dignity to every individual. And when you see another individual made as the image of God, then you will respond, as Peter says here, with gentleness. What's another word for that? With considerate ways of responding, with consideration. In other words, as Jesus would say, you're going to be salt and you're going to be light, right? Doesn't mean that we back away from speaking the truth, but rather we speak the truth in such a way that we respect and dignify other people. Right? This verse 15 brings to mind a lot of different ideas of how I've seen people use apologetics, right? Defending your faith. You guys have heard that before, right? Where too often what I've seen is that in answering for our faith, some have used the opportunity to defend the faith as a means to destroy an individual and just undignify them just to make a point or to win an argument, right? And so what happens, they're willing to dismantle a person rather than dismantle an ideology. God calls us to dismantle ideologies and falsehoods, but not at the expense of another individual. Peter here says, I want you to be winsome with how you are declaring the gospel and how you communicate with other people. Yes, speak the truth. Yes, stand for your convictions, but do so in such a way that you're literally a salt block for other people, that they're willing to say, man, I'm compelled by how you've even responded. Listen to me. Now more than ever, it couldn't be a more appropriate time for us to be able to respond in this way when there's so much vitriol, there's so much hate, there's so much back and forth of how people talk to each other. And yet we have a chance to be able to say outside of these walls, we can respond having all the confidence in the world of what the gospel can do in the lives of people, and yet not have to feel like we need to retaliate towards someone else and be hateful towards them. Peter says, hey, do so with gentleness and with reverence, with respect and with consideration. And he's saying that to people who were being persecuted. I mean, let that sink in. And then he calls us to do the same. And you may wonder, well, Paul, how? How in the world can I do that? How can I have the confidence to be able to share in that way? Well, verse 17 answers that. It gives us two incentives when we're slandered or disparaged for how we live. First of all, if you suffer. In other words, if this were to come your way, know that suffering comes as no surprise to God, and it is purposeful in one's life. So know that if you are disparaged, if you are slandered for your way of living, God is in control of even those circumstances. And then secondly, the other incentive is, let the testimony of your suffering be because of righteousness and not evil, right? Even in those moments, your conduct should display to the watching world that even in the midst of suffering and hurt and pain, that you are living out a conduct, an ethic that says it is good, it is righteous. Now, again, what's the incentive, right? Even in the midst of all of that, if you suffer for that, is that when you are slandered, know and be reminded that they will be humbled. In other words, there is coming a day where God will make all things right. And maybe, just maybe through your conduct, God will use that in order for people to be able to say, I saw the gospel written in your life. I saw the gospel through your words. And I was wrong about who Jesus was and about who you are. And one of the sweetest things that you can see is somebody repenting of their sins and believing in Jesus because of your example and because of your words. And if not, God forbid, that one day everyone will be humbled in knowing that the only lasting truth that will stand will be Jesus himself forever and ever. Right? And so those are our incentives to say, I can respond with respect and consideration. A couple of questions that I wanted to ask for you guys as we close out. One, believer, are you allowing fear or intimidation to silence you? And are you clinging on to Christ? Are you using him as your greatest incentive for being a courageous believer? Not because it's something that you can do, but because of what Jesus is doing in you and through you. Last word. This text here was probably one of the most challenging and convicting words that Peter could have written. You know why? Years prior, Peter was standing by a fire watching Jesus be taken to a trial. Was he not? And there was someone there that began to ask him, aren't you a follower of Jesus? And what did Peter say? No, I don't know what you're talking about. 3 times he denied Jesus. At that moment, he was not ready to give a defense for the hope that he had in him. He was broken. And you and I identify with Peter so much at that very moment. Why? Because we're just like him. We're broken, right? We're sinful, and we can allow fear, we can allow intimidation to grip our hearts so much so that we can even get to a place where we deny. We don't even speak for Jesus or even say, I don't follow Jesus. But what I love about Peter is the levels of grace that you find between him and Jesus, where he took a man who was broken and shattered from that moment, reconciled with him. And now he took somebody who was a denier of him and made him a bold proclaimer of him years later. Here we have Peter penning those words, not only for him, but for us. Listen to me. You may identify exactly with Peter, and you've allowed fear or intimidation to grip your heart. Could I submit to you that God can take even you and use the circumstances, reconcile you back to him, and then not give you a courage of your own, but give you his courage to see him gloriously as Lord and holy, to see him as the resurrected one, right? To see him as that Alpha and that Omega, as Peter saw him, as Peter writes about him. And then it's that picture of God that gets inserted into your heart, and you say, now because of who I know him to be, I want to be a bold proclaimer for Jesus. And I'm willing to stand in the face of criticism, in the face of a culture that says, man, you're weird. You're a strange individual. You're an exile in this culture. What's wrong with you? You say, no. I know that's what you may think of me, but I know the truth, and I know my Savior. And I'm willing to stand in the face of criticism and say, I know who my Savior is and who you need. And it's Jesus. Listen to me. If you've been fearful, I want you to do one thing alone. Look even to Peter's life. And the one thing I want you to be like him as is broken. Broken like him. And then willing to go to his Savior so that he can lift you up. And then you become like Jesus. All of us can. Do you know why I say everything that I say, guys? I say it because I believe that God calls us as believers to proclaim the gospel, be a visible demonstration of that gospel, both inside the church and outside of this church, ultimately for his glory and for the flourishing, the furtherance of his gospel. Let him use you even today. Let's pray.